This next topic is about basic Excel functions and some visualization things that we can do in Excel, right? So PC Apps is a prerequisite for this course, though I know not every student always ends up in this class before that. But so a lot of students have a fair amount of background with this. Given that this is being delivered as an online class, I'm going to strongly encourage you to check out some other online sources. And I'll also say, my goodness, the textbook for this section, I pulled some of the data sets from this textbook and put them up on Moodle. And so those, I mean, they can talk you through a whole bunch of it really, really well. If you go to the Moodle page for the class, and this is the new design of the thing, we're on the wrong topic. Topic 2, review of spreadsheets and data visualizations. Towards the halfway down, after the, yep, this is chapter 2. And actually, I think there might be some chapter 3 in this as well. Yep, there's chapter 2 and chapter 3 are the chapters that are in this, but we also list out some data, right? So we've got some EEO employment report data, monthly product sales data, sales transaction data, and there's a couple of readings for you to do. Also in chapter 1, there was a data file called memory data, and I'll talk about that in a couple of seconds, but I just wanted to point out where the data was so that you know where it is as you follow along with some of these things. We want to talk through what what some of these different pieces are. And again, just as a review, you could definitely get some other sources online, or you might be able to skip ahead if you're familiar with some of these. Do you know the difference between relative and absolute addresses, right? So we're going to do a fair amount of formulas in this whole class. And so let's pull up the EEO employment data report. Real quick, just to step back as a review, if we step back and look at the EEO employment report data, what kind of data are we looking at, right? So a good data set, you should be able to figure out pretty easily without that much context what's going on with it. So it looks like we've got some different categories, right? It's got some numbers measuring, what is it measuring? It's the number of employed in the state of Alabama in 2006. The EEO is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And so this is just counting up the number of people who are employed in the state of Alabama in 2006. That's the data that is from the textbook, follows through with it as well. And look, we've got a bunch of stuff. We've got breakdowns by race and ethnicity. We've got breakdowns by gender. It looks like column B has total employment. We've got some officials, professionals. So we've got different types of workers, and we've also got total employment. Wow, this is great, right? All of this is really nice. And it's got the breakdown for different professions by gender. That's really, really great information. What kind of information? What kind of data is this, right? So if you recall, we've got we have a couple of different data types of data, right? We've got panel data, we've got cross-sectional data, and we have time series data. What type of data is this EEO data set? So one of the quick visualizations that we can do with this this data set is, I don't actually want to do. One of the things that I'd like to calculate is what percent of total employment is male and female. Can I get there with this data? Actually getting there is going to involve a couple of different things, right? So what would be easiest, right? I've got the total employees, I've got the total male employees, I've got the total female employees. And so it'd be nice if I could easily calculate that number of what's the percent of employees that are male and female, somewhere close to these numbers, right? So I'm going to highlight column C, and then when I highlight column C, protected view. That's what it is. I've got a protected view of my stuff right now. No big deal. If I click on column C, what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click. I'm using a Windows-based system, right? So I do my right click and I can insert, and that's just going to add a column. If instead of having a column highlighted, if instead I had highlighted a row and I clicked insert, it would insert a column or insert a row. Pretty straightforward, right? So what's the formula that I'm looking for? What I'm looking for is a formula that calculates what percent of employees are males. So I'm just looking at males divided by total employees. How could I do that? So I'm using my equal sign, right? And you've got a couple of different things here. So whenever you do equal sign, it's going to start prompting you for some potential functions, right? So my guess is that you've got some familiarity with some of these functions. If not, we're going to talk through some of them, right? Or it can just allow you to do a calculation. So here we go. I can, my calculation, I'm going to select males, because that's my numerator, divided by total employment, right? And that's in B5 divided by B4. I hit equals, and I get the number 1. Gosh, that doesn't seem right. So under the Home tab, I've got a couple of different options there. And one of my options, I've just got mine shrunk down a little bit. That's why it may look a little bit different than yours, but it's still, right, under this number section, I want to just add a few decimal places. And if I even wanted, I could change it to a percent, right? And then add a few more decimal places. 55.25% of employees in Alabama in 2006 were males. Pretty straightforward, right? But notice as we're here that I can do this drop-down menu, and there's a number of different ways that I can try to format numbers. Sometimes you might be dealing with a data set where the numbers are formatted in a way that you don't like, and so that's where this can be useful. But again, back to it, most simple. The simple version of what we were telling with this story was the formulas, right? So I like, because I can, if I click on it, it highlights with what do you call those colors, what the different cells are that go into the calculation. Sometimes that's useful. So what I have right here with B5, B4, I'd refer to that as the absolute address of those cells. No, I'm sorry, those are the relative address of those cells. I got that backwards. It's relative because where I have my formula entered is in cell C5. And the way that this is written is telling Excel explicitly, right? Go one cell to the left and divide it by one cell above. That is relatively the way that this formula is being calculated. And that matters because I can take this formula and I want to copy it down right below. I've got females, right? So my goodness, can't I just divide females by the total? So a couple of ways I can copy it. Number one, I can just do my Control C for copy and then Control V for paste right below. Sorry, but online there's no way for me to show you what I'm doing with the keyboard. I can just say it, right? And that's one way to calculate, or to copy that formula down to the cell below it. Or alternatively, right, I can, if you look very, very closely, there's a little box in the bottom right-hand corner of this. When I click on that, on the little black box, and I'm on a surface, it's a little difficult to do this, I can either drag it down, which copies that formula down the column, or I could even drag it to the right, which copies that column to the right. So the other thing that I can do is if I have a long column of data, rather than clicking on that little square and dragging it all the way down, if I just double click it, it's going to automatically fill it down the column of data that I have. But what's the problem? Yep, the problem is that this is measuring a relative address. And so all it's doing is just maintaining the relative position, right? The formula is now in cell B6, and so relatively it copied that relative position, and it's just saying take what's to the left, the cell that's directly to the left, and divide it by the cell that's right above it. So we were dividing the number of women employed by the number of males employed, and the number that we get for that is 81%, but that number doesn't mean anything, right? 55% of our employees are males. I'm expecting about 45% of our employees to be females then, right? This number 81, it's a calculation, but it's not a useful one. Instead of using what we call these relative calculations, I'm going to undo these with Control Z as another good shortcut key to get used to using. I'm going to change my formula a little bit. What I have is in cell specifically C5, I'm calculating the number of men employed divided by, I want to divide that by the total employees, but when I copy this formula down to the next row, I still want the number of females divided by the total number of employees. What I want is for the number of males or females to change, but I don't want this B4, the total employees. I want that value not to change. And so the way I can do that is I can lock it in with its absolute address. The way that we do absolute addresses, there's two ways to do it. Number one, you can put dollar signs, not percentage, dollar signs before both the letter of the column and the letter of the row, or just one or the other if you wanted to maintain one of those. Or alternatively, and again, this is a shortcut key that's a little difficult to show you online, if instead of typing in the dollar signs, I can instead hit Shift 4. And now, this is the first time I'm doing this on the Surface, and that works, right? Shift, or the F4 key, Shift F4, play around with that, depending on the way that your keyboard is configured. That is the way to lock in what we call, with the dollar signs, the absolute value and the absolute cell location. And the reason that that's useful is now that I've got that denominator of that equation locked in, I can just drag that down a bit. Yep. Now what it did in my new formula, we can go investigate that new formula, it changed the numerator. The numerator, when I copied the formula down one cell, it moved the numerator down one cell, but it locked in place the denominator. And so this is going to be a really useful thing, right? Being able to use the relative location and the absolute location of cells, knowing when to use them, is something that you're gonna practice a whole lot in this class, right? Pretty straightforward. So we actually got a whole lot out of that little brief introduction to that data set. We've got this list of other topics that are useful for us to do. I mentioned copy and paste. My goodness, did I already close that? I did close that. So let's bring up something else. What's the next data set according to the website? I can't remember which one we go to next. It was the monthly product sales. Let's go ahead and pull up monthly product sales. What kind of data is this? Right? So think about what we're measuring in different columns. Think about what we're measuring in different rows. We're looking at sales. We've got in column A different months, and in columns B, C, D, E, and F, we've got different products A, B, C, D, and E. So what are we looking at? We're looking at a number of different products across a number of different months. Is it clear which kind of data that is? What I'd like to do here is I'd like to do an introduction to a couple of the basic formulas. And again, some of these you're probably already a little bit familiar with. Let's just think about for the month of January, so we're talking about for row 4, which product had the smallest level of sales? Or out of this data set, or out of the values in January, what was the minimum level of sales for a product? How do we do that? So again, so we hit the equal sign, and you may already be familiar with this one, MIN. Most of the time, if you just start typing out the word of what you think you want to do in Excel, it'll bring up a nice little prompt here that allows you to see a number of the different formulas. And there's a number of different iterations of things. And usually if you click on that, it's going to prompt you in terms of what it's looking for. The different, we call these things the different arguments of the formula. And so we're looking for the minimum, and I'm just selecting all of that data in columns B, C, D, E, and F of row 4, and I need to do a right parentheses to close out this formula. And if I hit enter, and we can just visually verify that, yep, is 3150 the smallest of any of the products for their January sales? Sure was. That's how we use the minimum formula. Let's go about it a different way, right? This little guy right up here. Insert function. Another really good friend for you to use, because it's got a lot of really common ones. So again, we've got Excel has such flexibility with it nowadays, right? That there's a number of different financial formulas that are built into Excel. And this is not a finance class or an accounting class, and so we're not going to go into those details. But you should absolutely be aware that there are a number of different, very, very complicated financial and accounting formulas which are easily available for you. Excel is prompting ton of these different things. But again, it's not a finance or an accounting class, so this isn't where we're going to teach you how to use those specific formulas, but I do want you to be aware that those formulas do exist so that when you get to your accounting or finance classes, you absolutely realize that they're there. We're going to use some of them in the statistics a whole lot later in this class. There's some other ones. The most recent, or that's most recently used, I thought it was most commonly used. The other thing we can do is you can just start typing out a little description. So minimum. Sometimes it'll bring up a couple of different things that are related to that word that you have. And one of them is the minimum. And again, it just tells you a little bit of how to input it. The nice thing about using this function button up top is it usually, almost always, brings up a dialog box, right? In this dialog box, it tells you specific, a little bit more detail, what the arguments need to represent. And so again, that one argument that we entered in our minimum function was that entire data of B4 through F4. That's the first one. And notice the nice thing about this dialog box, it automatically carries out the calculation and gives you a description of what it is, right? This is a pretty great little function. This function box returns the smallest number in a series. Da, 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 da. Great, perfect. Yep, the minimum. A lot of different ways that we can get there. How about the maximum? Who had the highest sales? Yep, not surprisingly, the word max is there. What did I just do in my typing this thing out? What I did is I did equal sign MAX right parentheses, and then I moved my cursor over 1 to F4 because that's at the end, or that's at the limits of one of my data, my series of data. This happens to be at the end point. And then what I did is I hit the period button and I used the shortcut keys of Control, Shift, left key. And it took me all the way to the beginning of this data, as far left as it could go. It went over too far by 1, so then I did Shift right key to move my selected area over 1, and I did my ending parentheses to close that guy out. So again, it's a little awkward to have to say that out loud, but those were the series of shortcut keys that I used with my hands to do something a little bit quickly. All right, so min, max, those are pretty straightforward formulas that are going to be pretty, I mean, those are really basic statistics. Another one, sum. If you had to guess, what do you think sum represents? Yep. Actually, it gives you a nice little description of the thing, right? It adds all of the numbers in a range together. And so if we do this, think about what this value represents, right? We're taking the sum of B4 through F4. That number, is it clear what that number would represent? How about if we do this the other way? What if we go to the bottom of column B and we do a sum of this column of data? B4 through B15? Think about what that one would represent, right? And if I go all the way down here, can I do the sum of, what is this? F15 through B4? Think about what that summation would be telling me, right? So again, there's a lot of different ways that I can do this thing, right? The other thing that I wanted to do, so we mentioned earlier that we can copy we can copy formulas down by taking this bottom little box, and I mentioned earlier, but I'm going to actually carry out that process now in a little bit more dramatic. If I just double click that, that's going to copy the formula down the entire column of where I have data. That's a useful thing to know as a little shortcut key. Unfortunately, this one where we were adding up the column, if I double click that one, Not surprisingly, it doesn't do anything. I say not surprisingly because, look, is there anything for the left? What double-clicking on that little box does is it copies it all the way down where you have data on the left. There is no data to the left. If I wanted to move this one to the right, I've got to manually drag that sucker over. Oh, look, and that's the number that we calculated earlier for a different summation. But notice that the formula that's actually here is a little bit different than the way that we got that value earlier. But if you think about what they represent, it should be pretty straightforward, right? So we've got our summations. Those are pretty straightforward. Let's go ahead and delete all those out, because it's nice to have the sum, but oftentimes, rather than looking at the total amount of something, we might care about the average. So average, same process as the summation notation, right? We do average, and there's one argument in this. It's just the B4 through F4, so it's just the range of data of which Excel is going to take the average. Think about, is it clear what that value would represent? And if we hop down here, same thing earlier, if we calculate this average of this column of data, is it clear what that average represents? And again, right, I can totally, if I wanted to, drag these to the, actually, instead of dragging to the right, what I can do it a different way. I'm going to do my copy, Control C for copying and Control V for pasting, right? So I can do Control C for copy, Control V for paste, and I can continue with this Control V stuff. I can also do the same process of Control C, Control V with copying data, right? So let's highlight that entire column and move over here and just do a Control V. If I do a Control V, it's going to bring all of those pieces of data. But when I get all the way down to the bottom of the list, notice what did I do? It copied the formula. If I just do Control C, Control V, my basic copy and paste, it's going to copy and paste all of the values and this formula, right? That's different from what I'm about to show you. Go back, undo that. So again, Control Z is a nice little undo function. I'm going to highlight this product E data, copy it. But now when I go over to column H, I'm going to go and click on right where I want to paste it. And let's right click again. And I've got a bunch of different paste options. And what I want you to do is I want you to move over one to this thing that says values. Click on that. Does it look any different to you? Probably doesn't, right? But let's go ahead and check it out, right? Oh, I've got my data, I've got my data, I've got my data. But then look at the very end. When you do the paste special and you insert the values, it's not going to copy the formulas. Rather, it's going to copy whatever that value is. So that, notice, if January sales, it turns out that they were misreported. They were actually 8,300. If I change that in my data set, it changes the average at the bottom. But if I were to update that to 8,300 in my copy, nope, didn't change anything, right? Because I was pasting the values, not the formulas. Certain times that's going to be useful to use the values. Certain times you're going to want to copy the formulas. And so just I wanted to point that out as something that you want to keep in the back of your mind to be thinking about. Okay, what else can we do? There are a number of different things that we can, extensions that we can do of this basic. There's also another one that your book goes through that we'll go ahead and do this, because this is kind of a useful one. Count. Again, I'm just highlighting a bunch of data. It has a single argument too. It's a really straightforward formula. It returned the number 12. Is that a surprise to you? Is it clear what the formula count would do? Right? It's simply just counting up things. So, another iteration of this, another more complicated version of count if, is when we do conditional counting. So conditional counting started out the same way, count, but now notice there's this option of count if. I'm just going to go ahead and enter that, and it counts the number of cells within a range that meet a given criteria. Right? So later on in this class, we'll do some applications where it becomes a little bit more obvious when this is useful. Let's go ahead and so notice there's the first thing says range, and then there's a comma, and then the criteria. This COUNTIF function has two arguments. The first argument is the range of data, and the second argument is the criteria that it's going to be counting for. Right? So the range, that represents what we've been doing already with the average and the sum and all those, right? It's just the range of data that Excel is going to be considering. So I've got my F15 through I've got B4 through B15, and now I do my comma, and notice now it's doing the criteria. So the criteria is going to be the criteria or the rule that Excel is going to apply to the data and see if that is true. If it meets the criteria, it's going to count it. We're counting up the number of observations in the data range that fit the criteria. So for example, let's have the criteria be that that it's equal to 8315. So what we're really asking here is, of all these 12 months, for product A, let's count up how many months sales were equal to 8315. Not surprisingly, there's only 1 month, right? We can visually just scan through that list and see that there's a whole lot of variation in these sales. And so, yep, there was just one single month that had sales of 8315. Let's add something to the criteria though, right? What if we were concerned with or interested in how many of the months had sales that were greater than 8315? How would we add that criteria to it? So you might be wondering, hey, can I just put the greater than sign? Can I say, oops, not less than, but greater than? How many, no, that's not the, there we go. How many had sales that were greater than 8315? Can I just do this formula? I did that intentionally. I knew it wasn't going to work. It gives me a little bit of an error term. In order to fill that out, you got to put, to include that kind of inequality criteria on a COUNTIF and many of the conditional, these if formulas, you got to put the quotes around it. And not surprisingly, right, if you just scan through the data to verify this is counting 5 months where sales were greater than 8315. So if I change this greater than to less than, not surprisingly, it's 6. We had 6 months that were less than 8315. We had 5 months that were greater than 8315, and we had 1 month that was equal to. How many had 8315 that were greater, or how many months were greater than or equal to, right? How do I incorporate that into my formula? Not surprisingly, we just do the greater than symbol and then the equal symbol, and now it's counting that there's 6 months, this is not a surprise to us, right? 6 months where the sales were greater than or equal to 8315. Right, so COUNTIF, it's not the only conditional formula, but again, it's just a nice little introduction to how we can do some of those things. And we can do some SUMIF and some AVERAGEIF and all of those kinds of things. That's one way that we could get, and again, I'm going to put a little label on this. This was counting the number of months above 83, was it 8315? Oh, it was short-term memory, 8315. Ooh, I want to resize that, right, so that it looks a little bit better. I'm sure you know this, right, that I can hold this down and I can move it, or I can double-click it and automatically resize it to the size of what I'm looking for. That's one way that I can very, very easily do a COUNTIF. I want to go through a little bit of a longer process where we count up the number of, I'm going to insert a column to do this, where we count up the number of months for product A where sales greater than, oh, it was greater than or equal than, wasn't it? Greater than or equal to of 8315, right? So greater than or equal to, actually, I'm going to change it back to For my initial starting value, let's start it with just greater than. So we've got the 5 months that are greater than, and I want to do a column that identifies whether or not they are greater than, the sales were greater than 83.15. And so I can look, in January, were they greater than 83.15? No, they were not. In February, no, they were not. No, no, no. Yes, 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 yes. Oh my goodness, it looks like there might be a little bit of a cyclical pattern here, right? We've got some no's and some yeses on these things. I can go through this list by myself and just eyeball it, but what if I have a list of 10,000 data points, right? I don't want to do that list by hand. So what's a way that I can get Excel to automatically look at all these values and tell me, yes, it's greater than, sales were greater than 83.15, or no, they were not? To do that, I need to use an if-then formula. So to invoke an if-then formula, equal sign and the word if. An if-then formula has 3 pieces of information to it. The first is a set of logic that Excel is going to evaluate, comma. Then, if that logic is true, what Excel needs to do, comma. If that logic is not correct, then what Excel needs to do, right? So it's really, you could think about it as a little bit of I can draw a little picture of this thing, right? The if, there's the first thing is the criteria that's going to be evaluated, comma, the thing that if it is true, what Excel is going to do, and the thing that Excel is going to do if it is, I want to put false, but I really want to say not true, right? In general, I think of this as a little diagram, right? Excel looks at a little argument, and it finds out whether it is correct, true, or not true. If it's true, it will go this way and display whatever you put after the first comma. If it's not true, it will do whatever you tell it after the second comma, right? And so I think of it as kind of the sequential branching sort of structure. Let's again bring up this monthly sales. Here we go. What we wanted to do is we want to evaluate for if the monthly sales are greater than 83.15. So let's go ahead and select cell B4, right? What I want to do is I want to create an if-then formula in Excel, and I'm going to copy it down this entire list. And so this first one, it's saying if this value in the cell right next to it in B4 is greater than 83.15, that's the first part. That's the argument that Excel is going to argument. Is the cell to the left greater than 83.15, comma. If that is true, what do we want Excel to do? Let's go ahead and let's add the word yes. And notice that I put yes in quotes because it's a word. That's the way that Excel handles this. They're a little touchy about the way that you do words and the way that you do numbers, and so just for your words, put those in quotes. If it's greater than 83.15, comma, that's what's after the first comma, let's go ahead and put yes. If it's not greater than 83.15, meaning that argument of B4 greater than 83.15 is not true, then we want it to display the word no. Let's close that out. And not surprisingly, right, this if-then statement created the word no. And what's nice is if I take this formula and I copy it down my list for the months, it's going to automatically generate. It's going to automatically, right, and again, this was a absolute or a relative formula that I used, right? This was a relative one, so that the position of that first argument, or the cell in that first argument, was always changing based on the position of where the formula was, right? As it goes down the list, it's just evaluating, is that cell to the left greater than 83.15? If it is, we said yes. If it isn't, we say no, right? So if-then statements are really useful for doing some really basic data manipulation, right? And again, we're going to practice with these a lot throughout this semester. I want to change one thing about my formula. What if instead of yes, we put the number 1? And instead of putting the word no, we put the word 0. Makes sense why C4 is now a 0? Because it was a no, right? If I, again, do this down the entire list, and if I add up all of these zeros and ones, what's the summation of that column of zeros and ones going to be? 5. Why? Because that was the, I'm going to move it down one spot, right? Because that was the number of months that were greater than 8315. Okay, little background. Why did I do that? Why did I change those to zeros and ones? We've got to introduce a term real quick. All right, so let's go ahead and take all this stuff away real quick. What I just did is I created what we call a dummy variable. A dummy variable is a variable that takes on values of zeros or ones, nothing else. A dummy variable takes on a value of 0 or 1. It's really useful as we try to put things into two categories. It's really useful if we've got some natural dichotomous variables or some nice binary variables like either passing or failing. There's no in between. It's one or the other. Those kinds of nice categorical variables. But we can also create dummy variables for ranges of data. So we could do is your income above 100,000 or not above 100,000, right? But dummy variables are always represented by zeros and ones. When we're creating a dummy variable, we often want to give them a name that indicates the thing that we are identifying with the ones. So for example, what we pulled up earlier is we were looking at the sales greater than 8315. So the way I'd want to write this is let's create a dummy variable for a dummy of sales over 8315. And that dummy variable, again, takes on two values. It's either going to be equal to a 0 or a 1. 0 if sales are not greater than 8315, and it's going to be a 1 if sales are greater than 8315. Right? So again, I might want to change this the title of this variable to dummy variable. It's a dummy variable on whether or not sales are greater than 8315. And so the nice thing about that naming convention is no matter who's looking at it, if we're all following the same convention with the way that we name things, then we know that it's the ones are representing the thing that the dummy variable is named after. Notice if we total up a series of data on a dummy variable, it's going to be counting up the number of ones. It's going to be counting up the number of observations that fit that criteria. I want to do one other thing real quick. Instead of taking a count, can we take an average of this dummy variable? Oops, was this accidentally? Oh, look at that. When I dragged that formula, it accidentally picked up cell C16. I don't want cell C16 in there. I want that to be C15. All right, so that fixes that. But my point was earlier, if we calculate the average of a dummy variable, 0.4166, think about what that might represent, right? 0.466. We had the average of the dummy variables. The dummy variables were all zeros and ones. We had a bunch of zeros, and we had, in fact, we had 7 zeros, right? And we had a bunch of ones. We had 5 ones. And then we're dividing by the total number of observations we had, which was 12. 5 over 12? That's 41. We can actually interpret that thing as a percent, right? It's actually, when we take the average of a dummy variable, what it's telling us is the frequency of the thing that's being identified by the dummy variable, right? Another thing that I'll throw out just as a piece of unsolicited advice is the textbook for this class is actually pretty decent in a lot of different respects, and one of them is they do a pretty good job of talking about the lookup functions, the VLOOKUP and all of that kind of stuff, and the index and the match. And so it's towards the end of chapter 2, and I'm not going to go into it right now because we don't really use it that much in this class. However, especially if you think that you're going to be going more of the finance or the accounting route, accounting route, you might want to spend just a few minutes reading through that text and playing around with some of the examples that they talk through, just to make sure that you've got a little bit of a good grounding in those things, because they're really useful. It does a pretty decent, succinct presentation of it, but again, for this analytics class, we actually don't use them that much. But again, check them out if you'd like.